Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of gaslight illuminating the pages of history as we embark on this peaceful odyssey through the life of Alfred Bernhard Nobel. This is not a tale of dramatic crescendos or jarring revelations, but rather a gentle meditation on genius, solitude, ambition, and ultimately, the profound human desire to leave behind something meaningful for future generations. Before we start, consider subscribing to the channel. Let the soothing rhythm of biographical storytelling wash over you as we explore how a frail child born into financial hardship would eventually command a global empire of explosives, accumulate one of the world's largest fortunes, and transform his legacy into the most prestigious awards humanity has ever known. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift alongside this fascinating figure as we uncover the quiet moments, the thoughtful deliberations, and the gradual evolution of a mind that would touch countless lives across centuries. Chapter 1. The Stockholm Beginning. On a crisp October morning in 1833, specifically the 21st day of that autumn month, Stockholm witnessed the birth of a child who would forever alter humanity's relationship with both destruction and recognition of achievement. The Gamla Stan district, with its medieval architecture and narrow cobblestone streets, provided the backdrop for Alfred Bernhard Nobel's entry into this world. The Nobel family home on that October day was filled with the quiet anticipation and gentle chaos that accompanies any newborn's arrival. Alfred's father, Emanuel Nobel, was a man of considerable intellectual gifts, though modest financial means at the time. An inventor by nature and an engineer by training, Emanuel possessed the restless creativity that would later manifest so profoundly in his son. His mind constantly worked on solving practical problems, from improving building techniques to experimenting with new methods of blasting rock. Alfred's mother, Andriette Alsel Nobel, brought stability and nurturing warmth to their household. Coming from a family of somewhat better financial standing than her husband's, Andriette would prove instrumental during the challenging years that lay ahead. Her quiet strength and unwavering support would become the foundation upon which young Alfred could develop his curious and sensitive nature. The child who entered the world that October day was delicate and prone to illness, characteristics that would remain with him throughout his life. Even in infancy, Alfred displayed an unusual sensitivity to his environment and a contemplative nature that seemed almost otherworldly to his parents. While other children might cry vigorously, Alfred was often found gazing thoughtfully at his surroundings, as if already absorbing the complexities of the world around him. Stockholm in 1833 was a city balancing between its medieval past and an increasingly industrial future. The cobblestone streets echoed with the sounds of horse-drawn carriages and the conversations of merchants conducting their daily business. The Nobel family lived modestly, yet they were part of a community that valued learning and innovation. Young Alfred's earliest memories would be shaped by the gentle sounds of his father's workshop, where Emanuel tinkered with various mechanical devices and pondered engineering challenges. The family's circumstances during Alfred's early childhood were marked by financial uncertainty. Emmanuel's various business ventures struggled to achieve the success he envisioned. The sound of adult conversations would drift into young Alfred's awareness, discussions filled with hope for better opportunities and concern about making ends meet. These early experiences with economic instability would later influence Alfred's drive for financial security and his appreciation for the precarious nature of success. Despite the financial pressures, the Nobel household maintained an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and warmth. Alfred's parents recognized their son's unusual intelligence and sensitivity from an early age. Rather than viewing his physical frailty as a limitation, they encouraged his natural inclination toward observation and learning. The family's modest library contained books that would spark Alfred's lifelong love of literature and learning. During these Stockholm years, Alfred was not alone in the family. He was the fourth son born to Emmanuel and Andriette, though tragedy had already visited their household. The Nobel family had experienced the profound sorrow that was all too common in 19th-century family life, with several children not surviving to adulthood. This early exposure to mortality would contribute to Alfred's contemplative nature and his deep appreciation for the fragility of human existence. Alfred's older brothers Robert and Ludwig were already showing signs of the inventive and entrepreneurial spirit that seemed to run in the Nobel bloodline. The household buzzed with discussions of mechanical innovations, business possibilities, and the exciting developments occurring in the broader world of science and industry. Young Alfred absorbed these conversations like a sponge, his quick mind already beginning to process complex ideas about how things worked and how they might be improved. The Stockholm of Alfred's early childhood was experiencing the early stirrings of the Industrial Revolution. Smoke was beginning to rise from new factories, and the traditional ways of life were slowly giving way to mechanization and mass production. For a curious child like Alfred, these changes provided endless fascination. He would spend hours watching craftsmen at work, observing the precision required in their trades and beginning to understand the relationship between scientific principles and practical applications. Chapter 2: The Russian Transformation. When Alfred was just 5 years old, his world underwent a dramatic transformation that would shape the remainder of his childhood and adolescence. The year 1838 brought with it a decision that would uproot the Nobel family from their familiar Stockholm surroundings and transplant them into the vastly different cultural and social landscape of Imperial Russia. Emmanuel Nobel's persistent financial struggles in Sweden had reached a critical juncture. His various business ventures, despite his considerable engineering talents, had failed to generate the financial stability his growing family required. The decision to leave Sweden was not made lightly, but necessity often compels us toward paths we might not otherwise choose. St. Petersburg, then the glittering capital of the Russian Empire, beckoned with promises of opportunity and the potential for a fresh start. The journey from Stockholm to St. Petersburg in the late 1830s was an undertaking of considerable magnitude for a family with young children. Alfred, still a delicate child prone to illness, would have found the extended travel both exhausting and fascinating. The changing landscapes, languages, and customs would have provided his curious mind with countless new observations and experiences to process. Initially, Emmanuel Nobel traveled ahead to St. Petersburg alone, leaving Andriette and the children behind in Stockholm. This separation placed considerable strain on the family, but it also demonstrated Andriette's remarkable strength and resourcefulness. To support her family during this period of separation, she opened a small grocery store, selling milk and vegetables to their Stockholm neighbors. The sight of his mother working tirelessly to provide for the family undoubtedly left a lasting impression on young Alfred, instilling in him a deep respect for perseverance and hard work. The reunion in St. Petersburg in 1842 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Nobel family story. The city that greeted them was a marvel of imperial grandeur, with its magnificent palaces, broad avenues, and the impressive architecture that embodied the power and ambition of the Russian Empire. For 9-year-old Alfred, the contrast between modest Stockholm and magnificent St. Petersburg must have been breathtaking. St. Petersburg in the 1840s was experiencing a period of remarkable growth and modernization. The Russian Empire, under the reign of Tsar Nicholas I, was investing heavily in military technology and infrastructure. This environment provided exactly the opportunity that Emmanuel Nobel had been seeking. His engineering expertise and innovative approaches to manufacturing proved valuable to the Russian military, and soon the Nobel family found themselves in dramatically improved financial circumstances. The transformation in the family's fortunes was remarkable. From the financial struggles of their Stockholm years, they now enjoyed a level of prosperity that afforded young Alfred and his brothers educational opportunities that would have been unimaginable in their previous circumstances. Private tutors were engaged to provide the Nobel children with a comprehensive education that went far beyond what would have been available to them in Sweden. Alfred's education in St. Petersburg was nothing short of extraordinary for its time. His tutors, who included both Swedish and Russian instructors, recognized his exceptional intellectual abilities and tailored their instruction to nurture his natural gifts. By the age of 16, Alfred had achieved fluency in Swedish, Russian, French, English, and German. This linguistic facility would prove invaluable throughout his life, enabling him to communicate effectively across cultural and national boundaries as his business interests expanded internationally. The St. Petersburg years were formative in developing Alfred's scientific interests, particularly his fascination with chemistry. His tutors introduced him to the fundamental principles of chemical reactions, the behavior of different substances under various conditions, and the emerging field of organic chemistry. These lessons took place not in sterile academic settings, but in practical laboratories where Alfred could observe, experiment, and begin to develop his own theories about how chemical processes might be harnessed for useful purposes. During these Russian years, Alfred's personality began to take definitive shape. He was recognized as intellectually gifted, but also noted for his introspective and somewhat melancholic nature. While his brothers Robert and Ludwig showed more extroverted personalities and gravitated toward the business and social aspects of their father's expanding enterprise, Alfred seemed naturally drawn to solitary study and contemplation. His tutors observed that he possessed an unusual combination of scientific rigor and poetic sensibility, often finding him reading literature with the same intensity he brought to his chemistry studies. The Nobel family's social position in St. Petersburg exposed Alfred to the broader intellectual and cultural currents of 19th-century Europe. The family home became a gathering place for engineers, scientists, and business leaders who were contributing to Russia's modernization efforts. Young Alfred absorbed these discussions about technological innovation, international commerce, and the practical applications of scientific discovery. These conversations would prove instrumental in shaping his later understanding of how scientific knowledge could be transformed into business opportunities. Alfred's health during the St. Petersburg years remained a source of concern for his parents. The harsh Russian winters and the demanding pace of his education sometimes overwhelmed his delicate constitution. However, rather than limiting his activities, his periodic illnesses seemed to deepen his contemplative nature and strengthen his determination to make the most of the time and opportunities available to him. His parents, recognizing both his intellectual gifts and his physical limitations, carefully balanced his educational pursuits with attention to his health and well-being. The industrial environment of St. Petersburg provided Alfred with his first exposure to large-scale manufacturing and the practical application of engineering principles. His father's factories, which produced military equipment for the Russian army, demonstrated how scientific knowledge could be translated into tangible products that served important social purposes. Alfred spent considerable time observing the manufacturing processes, asking questions about efficiency improvements, and beginning to think about how existing technologies might be enhanced or replaced with superior alternatives. Chapter 3: The Journey of Discovery. In 1850, at the age of 17, Alfred embarked upon a journey that would fundamentally shape his understanding of the world and his place in it. His father, recognizing the need for his son to gain broader experience and education, sent him on an extended study tour that would take him to Sweden, Germany, France, and the United States. This journey represented not merely an educational opportunity, but a rite of passage into the broader world of international science and commerce. Alfred's first significant stop was Paris, the city of lights and learning, where he would spend a year studying chemistry under some of Europe's most distinguished scientists. It was in Paris that he entered the private laboratory of Professor Théophile Jules Pellouz, a renowned chemist whose work was advancing the frontiers of organic chemistry. Under Pellouz's guidance, Alfred delved deeper into the mysteries of chemical reactions, learning not only the theoretical foundations of the science, but also the practical skills of laboratory work. But it was in Pellouz's laboratory that Alfred encountered a discovery that would change the course of his life, and indeed, the course of human history. There he met Ascanio Sobrero, a young Italian chemist who, 3 years earlier, had synthesized a revolutionary new compound called nitroglycerine. This oily, colorless liquid possessed explosive power far beyond anything previously known, but it was so unstable and dangerous that Sobrero himself considered it too perilous for practical use. Alfred became fascinated by nitroglycerine, sensing in this volatile compound possibilities that others could not see. While Sobrero and even the cautious Professor Pellouz warned of the substance's inherent dangers, Alfred saw potential for revolutionary applications in construction, mining, and engineering. His mind began to race with ideas about how this incredible power might be harnessed safely and effectively. From Paris, Alfred continued his educational journey to the United States, where he spent time working under the direction of John Ericsson, the Swedish-American naval engineer, who would later achieve fame as the builder of the ironclad warship Monitor. This experience in America exposed Alfred to the dynamic, entrepreneurial spirit of the New World, where innovation and practical application went hand in hand. He observed firsthand how scientific discoveries could be rapidly transformed into commercial enterprises, and how the right combination of technical knowledge and business acumen could create extraordinary opportunities. The America of the 1850s was a nation in the midst of explosive growth, where railroads were pushing across vast distances, where cities were rising from wilderness, and where the appetite for new technologies and innovations seemed limitless. For young Alfred, this environment was both exhilarating and educational. He absorbed lessons not only in engineering and chemistry, but also in the art of turning ideas into reality on a grand scale. When Alfred returned to Russia in 1852, he brought with him not only advanced technical knowledge, but also a new perspective on the possibilities that lay before him. He rejoined his father's business, which was now prospering as a supplier of military equipment during the Crimean War. The demand for innovative weapons and explosives had never been higher, and the Nobel family's expertise in these areas was increasingly valuable to the Russian military. But even as he worked in his father's successful enterprise, Alfred's mind remained focused on the tantalizing possibilities of nitroglycerine. He continued his experiments with the substance, trying to understand its properties and find ways to make it safer and more predictable. These early experiments were conducted under primitive conditions, without the safety equipment and protocols that would later become standard in chemical laboratories. The dangers were real and ever present, But Alfred's fascination with the compound's potential drove him to continue his investigations. During this period, Alfred also began to develop his skills as a writer and poet. He wrote verses in English, inspired by the Romantic poets Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, and began to cultivate the literary interests that would remain with him throughout his life. This artistic side of his nature provided a counterbalance to his scientific pursuits, offering him a means of expressing the more emotional and philosophical aspects of his character. Chapter 4: The Shadows of War and the Seeds of Innovation. The Crimean War, which raged from 1853 to 1856, brought both prosperity and moral complexity to the Nobel family business. Emmanuel Nobel's factory was working at full capacity, producing the underwater mines and other military equipment that were crucial to Russia's defensive efforts. The family's financial situation had never been better, and Alfred was gaining valuable experience in both the technical and business aspects of large-scale manufacturing. But the war also provided Alfred with his first direct exposure to the devastating human cost of armed conflict. While the Nobel family's mines may have helped defend St. Petersburg from attack, Alfred could not ignore the broader context of suffering and destruction that war inevitably brought. These experiences planted seeds of doubt and reflection that would later grow into his passionate advocacy for peace and his ultimate decision to establish the Nobel Peace Prize. As the Crimean War drew to a close in 1856, the demand for military equipment began to decline dramatically. Emmanuel Nobel's business, which had been so successful during the conflict, suddenly found itself struggling to adapt to peacetime conditions. The transition from military to civilian production proved more difficult than anticipated, and by 1859, the company was facing bankruptcy. This financial crisis marked a turning point for the Nobel family, and particularly for Alfred. The comfortable life they had built in Russia was crumbling, and difficult decisions had to be made about the future. Emmanuel and his youngest son, Emil, returned to Sweden, while Alfred and his older brothers remained in St. Petersburg, desperately trying to salvage what they could from the failing business. For Alfred, this period of uncertainty and financial stress was also a time of intense focus and determination. Free from the daily demands of his father's manufacturing business, he was able to dedicate more time to his experiments with nitroglycerine. He recognized that if he could solve the problem of this compound's instability, he might have the key to both personal success and revolutionary advances in mining, construction, and engineering. The challenge was formidable. Nitroglycerine was extraordinarily sensitive to shock, heat, and friction. The slightest jarring could cause it to explode unexpectedly, making it virtually impossible to transport or use safely. Many scientists had dismissed it as too dangerous for practical application, but Alfred remained convinced that there had to be a way to harness its power safely. Working in makeshift laboratories and often under dangerous conditions, Alfred began a systematic investigation of nitroglycerine's properties. He experimented with different methods of production, trying to create purer, more stable versions of the compound. He investigated various additives and mixing techniques, searching for ways to reduce the substance's sensitivity without diminishing its explosive power. These experiments required not only scientific knowledge, but also extraordinary courage. Alfred was working with a substance that could kill him instantly if handled incorrectly, and he had no safety guidelines or established protocols to follow. Every day in the laboratory was literally a matter of life and death, and the psychological stress of this constant danger began to take its toll on his health and temperament. During this period, Alfred also began to develop the detonating device that would prove crucial to the safe use of explosive compounds. He realized that the key to controlling nitroglycerine was not just making it more stable, but also finding a reliable way to detonate it precisely when and where desired. His invention of the blasting cap, a small device containing mercury fulminate that could be triggered by a fuse, represented a breakthrough in explosive technology. Chapter 5. The Tragic Catalyst. The year 1863 marked Alfred's return to Sweden, where he rejoined his father and youngest brother Emil to continue their experiments with nitroglycerine. The family established a laboratory at their property in Helleneborg, on the outskirts of Stockholm, where they hoped to perfect the production and application of this revolutionary explosive. The work was progressing promisingly. Alfred had successfully created his first commercial explosive product, which he called blasting oil, a liquid form of nitroglycerine that showed great potential for mining and construction applications. He had also refined his detonating cap system, making it possible to trigger explosions with much greater precision and safety than ever before. The future seemed bright with possibilities. But on September 3, 1864, tragedy struck with devastating suddenness. An explosion ripped through the Nobel laboratory at Helleneborg, killing 5 people instantly. Among the dead was Emil Nobel, Alfred's beloved younger brother, who was only 21 years old. Also killed were a laboratory assistant, a janitor, a young worker, and a carpenter who happened to be passing by the building at the time of the explosion. The scene that greeted rescuers was one of unimaginable horror. The force of the explosion had completely destroyed the laboratory building, scattering debris over a wide area. The bodies of the victims were so badly mangled that some were barely recognizable as human remains. For Alfred, who rushed to the scene, the sight was traumatic beyond description. The psychological impact of this disaster on Alfred cannot be overstated. He blamed himself for his brother's death and for the suffering of all the victims. The guilt and grief threatened to overwhelm him, and for a time, it seemed as though he might abandon his work with explosives entirely. The local newspapers were harsh in their criticism, calling the Nobel family irresponsible and dangerous, and public opinion turned sharply against their experiments. The Swedish government's response was swift and decisive. All further experiments with nitroglycerine were banned within the city limits of Stockholm, effectively shutting down the Nobel family's research efforts. For most people, This would have been the end of the story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing too far too fast in the pursuit of scientific advancement. But Alfred Nobel was not most people. Despite the tragedy, despite the criticism, despite his own crushing sense of guilt, he remained convinced that nitroglycerine could be made safe and useful. He felt that abandoning the work now would make his brother's death meaningless, and he was determined to find a way to honor Emil's memory by completing what they had started together. With characteristic ingenuity, Alfred found a way around the government ban. If he could not conduct his experiments on land within Stockholm's city limits, he would conduct them on the water. He acquired a barge on Lake Mälaren and converted it into a floating laboratory, complete with all the equipment necessary for the production and testing of nitroglycerine. This floating laboratory became the birthplace of the modern explosives industry. Working in isolation on the lake, far from populated areas where an accident might harm innocent people, Alfred continued his painstaking research into the properties and potential applications of nitroglycerine. He was driven by a combination of scientific curiosity, business acumen, and a deeply personal desire to prove that his brother's death had not been in vain. By 1864, Alfred had achieved a major breakthrough. He had developed a reliable system for the mass production of nitroglycerine and had refined his blasting cap technology to the point where controlled explosions were not only possible but predictable. His blasting oil was finding eager customers in the mining and construction industries, where its superior power compared to traditional black powder was immediately apparent. But Alfred knew that the instability of nitroglycerine remained a serious problem. No matter how careful the handling procedures, accidents were still possible during transport and storage. The substance was simply too sensitive to shock and temperature changes to be completely safe in its liquid form. What he needed was a way to stabilize the nitroglycerine without reducing its explosive power. Chapter 6: The Dawn of Dynamite. The solution to Alfred's greatest challenge came in 1866, during another period of intense experimentation on his floating laboratory. Alfred had been testing various substances as potential additives to nitroglycerine, hoping to find something that would absorb the liquid and make it more stable without significantly reducing its explosive force. He had tried mixing nitroglycerine with charcoal powder, sawdust, cement, and various other materials, but none had produced satisfactory results. Some additives made the mixture too insensitive to detonate reliably, while others failed to adequately stabilize the compound. Alfred was beginning to wonder if a truly safe form of nitroglycerine was possible when serendipity intervened. The breakthrough came when Alfred experimented with kieselguhr, a fine, porous sedimentary material composed primarily of the fossilized remains of diatoms, microscopic algae. This substance, also known as diatomaceous earth, had unique properties that made it ideal for absorbing liquids while maintaining structural stability. When Alfred mixed nitroglycerine with kieselguhr, The result was a paste-like substance that retained most of the explosive power of pure nitroglycerine, while being far safer to handle and transport. This mixture could be molded by hand into cylindrical shapes that fit perfectly into drill holes. It was stable enough to be dropped or shaken without exploding, yet could still be reliably detonated using Alfred's blasting cap system. Alfred had finally achieved his goal of creating a safe, practical explosive that could revolutionize construction and mining operations around the world. Initially, Alfred considered calling his invention Nobel's safety powder, hoping to improve his public image after the negative publicity surrounding the Helleneborg explosion. However, he eventually settled on a name that better captured the essence of his creation. Drawing from the Greek word dynamis, meaning power, he called his new explosive dynamite. On October 25, 1867, Alfred received his first patent for dynamite, marking the official birth of the modern explosives industry. But obtaining the patent was only the beginning. Alfred recognized that to realize the full potential of his invention, he would need to establish manufacturing facilities in multiple countries and develop a global distribution network. The business opportunities were enormous. Railroads were being built across continents, requiring tunnels through mountains and cuttings through hills. Mining operations were expanding into previously inaccessible areas, where dynamite's superior power could extract resources more efficiently than ever before. Construction projects that had once been considered impossible were suddenly within reach. But establishing a global explosives business was not without its challenges. Many governments were suspicious of explosives and imposed strict regulations on their manufacture and transport. Local competitors emerged in various markets, some of them producing unauthorized copies of Alfred's formulations. Patent infringement lawsuits became a constant concern, requiring expensive legal battles in multiple jurisdictions. Despite these obstacles, Alfred's business acumen and technical expertise enabled him to build a remarkable industrial empire. By the 1870s, he had established or acquired factories in more than 14 countries, employing thousands of workers and producing explosives for projects around the world. His companies were involved in some of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century, from the construction of the Panama Canal to the building of railway tunnels through the Swiss Alps. The success of dynamite transformed Alfred from a struggling inventor into one of the wealthiest men in Europe. But wealth and success did not bring him the happiness he had hoped for. The death of his brother continued to haunt him, and he remained acutely aware of the potential for his inventions to cause harm as well as good. This moral complexity would remain with him throughout his life, influencing his later decisions about philanthropy and his ultimate establishment of the Nobel Prizes. Chapter 7. The Wandering Years. Success in business brought Alfred many things, but a sense of home was not among them. As his explosives empire expanded across continents, he found himself living a peculiar kind of existence, constantly traveling between his various factories and laboratories, never staying in one place long enough to establish deep roots or lasting relationships. Alfred once wrote to a friend that home is where I work and I work everywhere. This was more than just a clever turn of phrase. It was an accurate description of his nomadic lifestyle. He maintained residences in multiple countries, but none of them ever truly felt like home. He was, as he sometimes described himself, Europe's richest vagabond. Between 1865 and 1873, Alfred's primary residence was in Hamburg, Germany, where he had established one of his most important explosives factories. The facility at Krumel produced dynamite for markets throughout Central Europe and served as a model for other Nobel installations around the world. Alfred lived in a magnificent house near the factory, complete with extensive laboratories where he could continue his research into new explosive formulations and applications. But in 1873, Alfred made a decision that would define the next chapter of his life. He moved to Paris, acquiring a splendid mansion on Avenue Malakoff that would serve as his primary residence for the next 18 years. Paris in the Belle Epoque was a city of extraordinary cultural vitality, home to artists, writers, scientists, and intellectuals from around the world. For Alfred, who had always been drawn to literature and the arts, Paris offered intellectual stimulation that complemented his scientific work. His Paris residence was much more than just a home. It was a salon where some of the most brilliant minds of the age gathered to discuss the latest developments in science, literature, and philosophy. Alfred's guests included Victor Hugo, the great French novelist and poet, as well as leading scientists and inventors from across Europe. These gatherings provided Alfred with the intellectual companionship he craved and helped to develop his thinking about a wide range of subjects beyond his immediate business interests. It was during his years in Paris that Alfred's interest in literature flourished. He wrote poetry in English, inspired by the romantic tradition of Byron and Shelley, and began work on what would eventually become his only published dramatic work, the tragedy Nemesis. His literary efforts were deeply personal, exploring themes of loneliness, love, and the search for meaning that reflected his own emotional struggles. Alfred's personal life during these years was marked by a profound sense of isolation. Despite his wealth and international prominence, he found it difficult to form close relationships. His constant travel made it hard to maintain friendships, and his intense focus on work left little time for social activities. He never married and had no children, though he did form several significant relationships with women throughout his life. The most important of these relationships began in 1876 when Alfred, then 43 years old, placed an advertisement in a Viennese newspaper seeking a wealthy, highly educated elderly gentleman seeks a lady of mature age, versed in languages, as secretary and supervisor of household. The most qualified respondent was Countess Bertha Kinsky, an Austrian noblewoman who would work for Alfred for 2 years before returning to Austria to marry Count Arthur von Suttner. Although their working relationship was brief, Alfred and Bertha von Suttner maintained an extensive correspondence for the rest of his life. She became one of his closest friends and confidants, and their letters reveal a man struggling with loneliness and searching for meaning beyond material success. Bertha, who would later become a prominent peace activist and author of the influential anti-war novel, Lay Down Your Arms, had a profound influence on Alfred's thinking about war, peace, and the moral responsibilities of those who create weapons. During these wandering years, Alfred also began to suffer from the health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. He complained frequently of headaches, digestive problems, and episodes of depression that seemed to worsen during periods of isolation. Some medical historians have speculated that his symptoms may have been related to prolonged exposure to nitroglycerine, which was known to cause severe headaches and other health problems in workers at explosives factories. Despite his wealth, Alfred found little comfort in material possessions. His letters from this period reveal a man who was deeply philosophical about the nature of happiness and success. He wrote, "Contentment is the only real wealth, and I am a misanthrope, but exceedingly benevolent. I am very cranky, and am a super-idealist." These apparent contradictions captured the essential complexity of his character during these years. Chapter 8. The Italian Refuge. In 1891, after nearly 2 decades in Paris, Alfred made another major change in his living arrangements, this time moving to a villa in San Remo, Italy. This move was not entirely voluntary. It was precipitated by a serious conflict with the French authorities over his development of a new explosive called ballistite, which the French government considered a military secret. The villa that Alfred purchased had originally been called Mio Nido, my nest, by its previous owner, a Polish poet. Alfred renamed it Villa Nobel, and it would become his final home. The property was magnificent, featuring Moorish-style architecture, extensive gardens, palm trees, and orange groves, all overlooking the sparkling Mediterranean Sea. For Alfred, who had been suffering from increasingly poor health, the mild climate of the Italian Riviera provided welcome relief. The warm, sunny days were a stark contrast to the cold, damp winters he had endured in Paris and Hamburg, and he found that his chronic health problems were somewhat alleviated by the Mediterranean environment. Villa Nobel quickly became not just a residence, but also a center for Alfred's continuing scientific work. He had a state-of-the-art laboratory built on the property, equipped with the latest scientific instruments and safety equipment. The laboratory included facilities for chemical experiments, ballistics testing, and even a small jetty extending into the sea where he could test firearms and explosives safely away from populated areas. Working alongside Alfred in his San Remo laboratory were 2 assistants who would play crucial roles in his final years. Ragnar Solman, a young Swedish engineer who had originally been hired as a secretary, became Alfred's chief laboratory assistant and eventually one of the executors of his will. George Beckett, an English chemist, also worked closely with Alfred on various experimental projects. The years in San Remo were among Alfred's most productive in terms of both scientific research and literary pursuits. He continued to develop new explosive formulations and spent considerable time working on improvements to existing products. He also devoted increasing attention to his writing, completing his tragedy Nemesis, and working on a satirical play called The Patent Bacillus, which was inspired by his legal battles over explosive patents. But perhaps more importantly, it was during his years in San Remo that Alfred began to think seriously about his legacy and how he wanted to be remembered. The 1888 incident, when a French newspaper had mistakenly published his obituary instead of his brother Ludwig's, calling him a merchant of death who had grown rich by finding ways to kill people more efficiently, had deeply affected him. The prospect of being remembered primarily as a creator of instruments of destruction troubled him greatly. Alfred's correspondence with Bertha von Suttner during these years shows his growing interest in peace and international cooperation. She repeatedly urged him to use his wealth and influence to support the international peace movement, and their letters reveal his evolving thoughts about war, peace, and the responsibilities of those who create weapons. While he remained skeptical about some aspects of the peace movement, he was clearly influenced by Bertha's passionate advocacy. The physical isolation of San Remo also gave Alfred time for deep reflection about his life and achievements. Despite his enormous success in business, he remained troubled by questions about the ultimate meaning and value of his work. He had created inventions that had revolutionized construction and mining, enabling projects that would have been impossible without dynamite. But those same inventions were increasingly being used for military purposes, contributing to the destructiveness of modern warfare. In his notebooks from this period, Alfred wrote extensively about his hopes and fears for the future of humanity. He believed passionately in the power of science and technology to improve human life, but he also recognized the potential for those same forces to cause tremendous harm. This tension between the constructive and destructive potential of human knowledge would ultimately drive his decision to establish the Nobel Prizes. Chapter 9. The crown jewel of industry. In 1894, just 2 years before his death, Alfred made what would be his final major business acquisition. He purchased Ab Bofors Gullspång, a Swedish ironworks and armaments manufacturer located in Karlskoga. This acquisition was significant not only as a business investment, but also as Alfred's attempt to create a more permanent connection to his homeland. Bofors had a long and distinguished history dating back to 1646, when it was established as a royal state-owned forge. By the time Alfred acquired it, the company had evolved into one of Sweden's leading steel producers and had recently begun manufacturing artillery pieces. Alfred saw great potential in the company's combination of metallurgical expertise and weapons manufacturing capabilities. Alfred invested heavily in modernizing the Bofors facilities, installing the latest equipment, and establishing new research laboratories. He also built himself a residence at nearby Björkborn Manor, which became his Swedish home. For a man who had spent most of his adult life as a rootless wanderer, the acquisition of Bofors represented something approaching a homecoming. The Bofors purchase also reflected Alfred's evolving business strategy. Rather than simply manufacturing explosives, he was moving toward a more integrated approach that included the development of complete weapons systems. This shift positioned his companies at the forefront of the rapidly evolving arms industry and ensured their continued profitability in an increasingly competitive market. But the focus on military applications also intensified Alfred's moral struggles about his legacy. While he had originally developed dynamite for peaceful purposes such as mining and construction, it was becoming increasingly clear that his inventions were playing a major role in making warfare more deadly. The guilt he had felt since his brother's death in 1864 was now compounded by concerns about the broader implications of his life's work. Alfred's health continued to deteriorate during his final years. He suffered from angina pectoris, a painful heart condition that caused severe chest pains and left him increasingly frail. Ironically, his doctors recommended that he take nitroglycerine as a treatment for his heart problems, but Alfred refused, writing to his assistant Ragnar Solman, "Isn't it the irony of fate that I have been prescribed nitroglycerine to be taken internally?" Despite his declining health, Alfred remained intellectually active and continued to work on new inventions almost until the end of his life. His final patents included improvements to explosive formulations and new applications for existing products. He also maintained his correspondence with friends and business associates around the world, though his letters from this period reveal increasing fatigue and a growing preoccupation with questions about mortality and legacy. The complexity of managing his global business empire during this period was enormous. Alfred's companies operated in more than 20 countries and employed thousands of workers. Coordinating production, marketing, and research across such a vast network required constant attention and frequent travel, despite his deteriorating health. His assistants, particularly Ragnar Solman, took on increasing responsibilities as Alfred's energy began to flag. During his final years, Alfred also became increasingly interested in philanthropy. He made substantial donations to various scientific and educational institutions, and began to think about ways to use his wealth for the benefit of humanity. These early philanthropic efforts were a preview of the much larger bequest that would be revealed in his will. Chapter 10. The Testament of Hope. On November 27, 1895, in Paris, Alfred Nobel signed what would prove to be one of the most important documents in the history of human achievement. His final will and testament, written in his own hand and witnessed by 4 friends, contained provisions that would astonish the world and create a lasting legacy that continues to inspire excellence in human endeavor more than a century later. The will was remarkably brief, occupying barely more than 1 page, yet its implications were profound. After making specific bequests to relatives and friends, Alfred directed that the remainder of his vast fortune be used to establish annual prizes for those who had made the most significant contributions to humanity in 5 specific fields: physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. The language of the will was both specific and idealistic. Alfred wrote that the prizes should be awarded to those who, during the preceding year, shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. This phrase captured perfectly Alfred's vision of using his wealth to encourage and recognize achievements that would advance human knowledge and promote human welfare. The decision to include a peace prize was perhaps the most surprising element of the will. Alfred had spent much of his career developing weapons and explosives, yet he chose to use his fortune to reward efforts to reduce conflict and promote international cooperation. This decision reflected the profound influence of his friendship with Bertha von Suttner and his own evolving thoughts about the moral responsibilities of inventors and industrialists. The will also contained specific instructions about how the prizes should be administered. The physics and chemistry prizes were to be awarded by the Swedish Academy of Sciences, the physiology or medicine prize by the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, the literature prize by the Swedish Academy, and the Peace Prize by a committee selected by the Norwegian Parliament. These arrangements reflected Alfred's desire to ensure that the prizes would be awarded by respected institutions with appropriate expertise in each field. One of the most remarkable aspects of the will was Alfred's insistence that nationality should play no role in the selection of prize winners. He wrote, "It is my express wish that in awarding the prizes no consideration be given to nationality, but that the most worthy shall receive the prize, whether he be Scandinavian or not." This provision reflected Alfred's cosmopolitan outlook and his belief that excellence in human achievement transcends national boundaries. The decision to establish the Nobel Prizes was not made impulsively. Alfred had been thinking about his legacy for years, and he had discussed the idea of creating prizes with several friends and correspondents. His letters to Bertha von Suttner contain references to his plans for promoting peace, though he was characteristically secretive about the specific details. The will created immediate controversy when it was made public after Alfred's death. Many of his relatives were shocked to discover that they would inherit only modest amounts, while the vast majority of his estate would go to support the prizes. Some family members contested the will, arguing that Alfred had not been of sound mind when he wrote it. The international character of the prizes also drew criticism from Swedish nationalists, who believed that such a large fortune should be used primarily for the benefit of Swedish institutions and causes. The fact that the Peace Prize was to be awarded by Norwegians rather than Swedes added another layer of complexity, especially given the tensions between Sweden and Norway during this period. Legal challenges to the will continued for several years after Alfred's death. The complexity of settling an estate that included assets in multiple countries, combined with family opposition and various technical legal issues, meant that it was not until 1901 that the first Nobel Prizes could actually be awarded. The establishment of the Nobel Prizes represented the culmination of Alfred's long struggle to find meaning and redemption in his life's work. Through these prizes, he sought to transform his legacy from that of a merchant of death to that of a promoter of human achievement and progress. The irony was profound. A man who had made his fortune from explosives and weapons would be remembered primarily for his contributions to peace and scientific advancement. Chapter 11. The final chapter. As 1896 dawned, Alfred Nobel was a man whose body was failing even as his mind remained sharp and engaged. The chest pains that had plagued him for years were becoming more frequent and severe, and he was increasingly frail and tired. Yet he continued to work, driven by the same restless energy that had characterized his entire life. Alfred spent the early months of 1896 dividing his time between his various residences and business interests. He traveled between San Remo, Paris, and Sweden, checking on his factories and laboratories, meeting with business associates, and continuing his research into new explosive formulations. Despite his declining health, he remained actively involved in managing his global industrial empire. The summer of 1896 found Alfred at Villa Nobel in San Remo, where the warm Mediterranean climate provided some relief from his symptoms. He worked in his laboratory, conducted experiments, and maintained his extensive correspondence with friends and business associates around the world. His letters from this period reveal a man who was clearly aware that his time was limited, but who remained determined to make the most of whatever time remained to him. In October 1896, Alfred wrote what would be his final letter to Ragnar Solman, his trusted assistant and future executor of his will. The letter discussed various technical matters related to their ongoing experiments, but it also contained more personal reflections. Alfred mentioned his declining health and expressed gratitude for Solman's loyal service and friendship. As autumn turned to winter, Alfred's condition worsened noticeably. The chest pains became more severe and more frequent, and he was often too weak to work for extended periods. Yet he continued to push himself, driven by a sense that there was still important work to be done. On the evening of December 9, 1896, Alfred suffered what appeared to be a mild stroke. He was helped to his bed by his servants, who were concerned about his condition, but hoped that rest would help him recover. Alfred himself seemed to recognize the seriousness of his situation, but he remained conscious and alert. During the night, Alfred's condition deteriorated rapidly. In the early hours of December 10, 1896, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. The servants summoned local doctors, but there was little they could do. Alfred Nobel, the man whose inventions had literally moved mountains and whose legacy would inspire human achievement for generations to come, died quietly at 2:00 a.m. on December 10, 1896, at the age of 63. The irony of Alfred's final hours was not lost on those who knew him well. The man who had devoted his life to harnessing the power of controlled explosions died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the quiet beauty of his Mediterranean villa. The man who had never married and had no children died alone except for his servants, yet his legacy would touch the lives of millions of people around the world. News of Alfred's death spread quickly through the international scientific and business communities. Tributes poured in from around the world, praising his contributions to science, industry, and human progress. Yet many of those who knew him best also recognized the personal struggles and moral complexities that had defined his life. The opening and reading of Alfred's will created a sensation that reverberated around the world. The discovery that he had left the vast majority of his fortune to establish prizes for human achievement rather than to his family was front-page news in newspapers across Europe and America. The decision was seen as both incredibly generous and somewhat eccentric, typical of a man who had always marched to the beat of his own drummer. The immediate aftermath of Alfred's death was complicated by the legal and administrative challenges involved in implementing his will. The sheer complexity of settling an estate that included assets in multiple countries, combined with family challenges and various technical legal issues, meant that several years would pass before the first Nobel Prizes could actually be awarded. But Alfred's vision would ultimately prevail. In 1901, the first Nobel Prizes were awarded to individuals who had made outstanding contributions to physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. The prizes immediately became the most prestigious awards in their respective fields, exactly as Alfred had hoped. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the remarkable life of Alfred Nobel, we find ourselves contemplating a legacy that continues to illuminate our world with hope and inspiration more than a century after his passing. The man who began life as a frail child in Stockholm, who survived family tragedies and personal struggles, who built a global industrial empire, and grappled with profound questions about the moral implications of his work, ultimately chose to use his fortune to celebrate the very best of human achievement. Alfred Nobel's story is one of transformation and redemption, of a man who recognized that true immortality comes not from the wealth we accumulate or the power we wield, but from the positive impact we have on the lives of others. Through the Nobel Prizes, he created a lasting monument to human excellence that has recognized and encouraged some of the most important advances in science, literature, and peace over the past century. The prizes bearing his name have honored discoveries that have revolutionized our understanding of the universe, from the structure of the atom to the nature of DNA. They have celebrated literary works that have captured the human experience in all its complexity and beauty. They have recognized efforts to build bridges between nations and cultures, to reduce suffering, and to create a more peaceful and just world. But perhaps most importantly, Alfred Nobel's legacy reminds us that each of us has the power to choose how we will be remembered. Despite the moral complexities and personal struggles that marked his life, Alfred found a way to transform his legacy from one of destruction to one of hope and inspiration. His story encourages us to consider not just what we can achieve in our own lifetimes, but what we can leave behind for future generations. As you drift gently toward sleep, carrying with you the story of this remarkable man, perhaps you might reflect on the ways in which each of us can contribute to human progress and understanding. Alfred Nobel's life reminds us that greatness is not measured by wealth or power, but by the positive difference we make in the world around us. The quiet villa in San Remo where Alfred spent his final years still overlooks the Mediterranean Sea, now serving as a museum dedicated to his memory. The laboratories where he conducted his groundbreaking research have been preserved, offering visitors a glimpse into the mind of one of history's most influential inventors. And around the world, the institutions that award the Nobel Prizes continue to honor his vision of recognizing and encouraging the highest achievements of the human spirit. Before we conclude our peaceful exploration, I gently invite you to subscribe to our channel if you found this journey through Alfred Nobel's life both informative and soothing. Your support helps us continue creating these thoughtful, in-depth explorations of remarkable lives and important topics. If you enjoyed learning about Alfred Nobel's transformation from a struggling inventor to a global philanthropist, please consider sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of his life did you find most inspiring or thought-provoking? In the gentle tradition of these bedtime stories, take a moment to reflect on Alfred Nobel's most enduring insight that true success lies not in what we accomplish for ourselves, but in what we contribute to the betterment of humanity. His legacy continues to inspire scientists, writers, and peacemakers around the world, reminding us all that even from the most complex and troubled lives can emerge gifts of immeasurable value to future generations. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the story of Alfred Nobel demonstrates the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to find redemption, to seek meaning beyond material success, and to create lasting legacies that continue to benefit humanity long after we are gone. In his own words, the most important thing in life is not the position one occupies, but the direction one is moving. May his journey from merchant of death to champion of human achievement inspire your own path toward making a positive difference in the world. Like and share this video if you found Alfred Nobel's story as fascinating and inspiring as we intended it to be. Sweet dreams, and may your own life, like that of Alfred Nobel, ultimately be remembered for the good you brought into the world rather than the challenges you faced along the way.